This last week of the course, we'll be reading and thinking and writing about what can be called the political culture of the nation, or what might more properly be called the multiple political cultures present in different parts of the country. Actually, you can see these across not just regions and states, but even within many individual communities themselves. You can see some of these differences. The way the media has talked about this over the last decade or so has been in terms of a kind of red America versus a blue America. And we'll go ahead and use that terminology this week, although there may be other more sensitive ways to think about culture than this particular one. Now, first of all, let me say that the concept of political culture can be fairly difficult to define, but it does involve, at a minimum, some combination of ideology about politics as well as a demographic element, meaning that the nature of one's community and where one lives has a sort of reciprocal effect on someone's political beliefs as well. So, from one standpoint, the U.S. is a remarkably united country in terms of its overarching ideas about government. Now, of course, what I mean by this is that the vast majority of Americans agree that we are and should be a liberal, pluralist democracy with a representative form of government very similar to what we have. Most Americans really like our two-house Congress and our separated power systems and the way we do government in general. And of course, the same can't really be said about most other countries in the world. In Europe, for example, there are socialist parties and communist parties, as well as right-wing parties in a lot of those countries. And there's just a huge spectrum of attitudes toward government within much smaller political entities. But once you get beneath that general agreement about our form of government, you see some fairly significant disagreements about the nature or role of government in our lives. And of course, these disagreements are what are at the heart of a great many of our contemporary political debates. Now, in general, we say that someone is conservative if they believe government should really be a minimal force in society. So conservatives generally believe that we should have an economy that operates on free market principles with relatively little regulation or intrusion by the government into businesses. They usually want taxes to be low and distributed fairly equally across members of society. They typically think a proper role of government is to keep peace and order in society. So they usually support vigorous law enforcement efforts. Though many of them want government to stay out of people's personal and social lives, many conservatives are, in fact, comfortable with government playing a strong role in terms of maintaining traditional values and institutions in society. And lately, this has meant supporting heterosexual marriage and opposing easily available abortion services. And conservatives generally resist large-scale social welfare programs because they believe that such programs provide too many incentives for people not to work hard or to be disciplined or productive members of society. Now, on the other hand, we say someone is a liberal if they believe government should play a more active role in the social order. So, for example, liberals generally believe that the free market, if left to itself, will reward the wealthy and big businesses, and that the economy will only function well if government regulates and polices businesses and corporations so that they play fairly with one another and do not treat ordinary workers unfairly. Liberals usually want to see what we call progressive taxation, where the wealthiest Americans pay a larger share of their income in taxes than the middle and lower classes, and they want government to help redistribute taxes to help meet the needs of the poor and the unfortunate. While liberals do want an ordered society, they also want government officials to operate with lots of restrictions, lest individuals be harmed by those with law enforcement power. They typically also want government to protect the rights of the poor and minorities, being concerned that without government involvement, the majority will work to marginalize those members of society. And they also typically favor large social welfare programs as the primary means of helping those who don't have the means of supporting themselves. And of course, we have relatively few people who are purely conservative on the one hand or purely liberal on the other. Rather, we've got a kind of mixture where we've got people all along the spectrum and somewhere in between the two poles. Probably at least a quarter of Americans, some would argue closer to a third, some would argue closer to 10 or 15%, are somewhere in the middle, or people that we sometimes call centrists. And those tend to be people who are comfortable with a fairly large government that's involved in a lot of aspects of society, but they also want to keep that government from becoming too expensive or too powerful or too clumsy in terms of solving problems. Now, bringing this to the red-blue discussion, in recent decades, the Republicans have been most closely associated with conservatism, while Democrats have been associated with liberalism, with red characterizing Republican-leaning states or areas, and blue characterizing Democratic states or areas. Now, this is what the electoral map looked like for the 2008 presidential election in red and blue terms and at the county level. What you can see here is that the more rural parts of the country, and especially the great sort of middle and southern parts of the nation, voted quite heavily red or Republican, whereas the more urban areas along both coasts and in the Great Lakes region tended to vote pretty heavily blue or Democratic. Now, of course, the fact that Barack Obama and the Democrats won that election quite handily, even though the Republicans dominated most of the area of the country, really just means that the big cities and the populated industrial parts of the country tended to vote Democratic, and the less populated rural areas voted Republican, but of course were overwhelmed at the polls. And we can explore how this breaks down as we proceed this week. By the way, if you break down the vote by state rather than by county, the way the blue versus red shakes out looks a bit more impressive for the blue voters. Now, indeed, arguably, Obama won in 2008 because a number of the key states in the South and Midwest, particularly Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, also Indiana, Ohio, Colorado, and New Mexico, voted Democratic rather than Republican, as they've done in a number of previous elections. These tend to be the so-called swing states, which can go one way or the other from presidential race to race, whereas many of the other states tend to vote consistently either red or blue. So if Obama wants to win re-election in 2012, he'll have to keep most of these states in his camp and not let Romney take those states away from him.